All right, we are in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Verse 1 goes to the previous passage. I don't remember. I don't think we actually read it last time, so I'll have Allison include that when we do the video for it. But it actually starts in verse 2 to 16.
Now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ. The head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman. And all things are from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. For her hair is given to her for a covering. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God.
Yeah, this is a really controversial passage, right? There's like a million different people who want to say a million different things about it. Half of them, actually, I want to say 85% of them is a bunch of hearsay nonsense that is not scholarly at all. You hear all sorts of things like, oh, this is just talking about like Paul doesn't want women to look like prostitutes, or it's like, where are you getting that? That's completely made up. That has nothing to do with anything. That's not true. So you'll have people who are like, well, this is just cultural. There's something going on in Corinth that these women were trying to usurp authority or whatever it may be. Again, there's nothing in the text that indicates that at all. There's nothing in Corinth in the culture that would indicate that that's specifically the issue. And so I want you to notice before we even get into it that as Paul makes his argument, he's going to make what I call a priority argument. That is, he's going to appeal to creation. I did my THM thesis on this at Westminster. And when priority arguments are used, either in Second Temple Jewish literature or the New Testament, they always are meant to show what God intends above everything else. So they are talking about universal principles, never something that's merely cultural. So whatever this is saying, it is saying that the church is to do this now, period, always. It is not a cultural thing. Otherwise, he would not appeal to creation. So he appeals to creation, and he appeals to nature, and when he does those things, he's actually trying to say this is universal. It's not something cultural. So all those explanations are trying to say, well, this is a specific problem in Corinth. I don't think that's true. There is an issue going on here in Corinth, but what he says is universally the case of what the church should practice. What I'm going to say is I think the big issue here is not so much what the nature of the covering is. We'll talk a lot about that in a minute. But the bigger issue is gender distinction. And I think that's really what Paul's trying to drive at. Remember that the Corinthians have misunderstood spirituality. And I think what they've done is Paul mentions here that he has handed down traditions to them. And one of the things it seems like is in the background here is that he taught them that there's no difference between male and female because all are one in Christ. That statement he makes in Galatians. But it seems like they've misunderstood that to mean, therefore, there's no more roles for men and women. Men and women are no longer distinct. And therefore, it's okay to actually look alike, to dress alike, to look alike, to basically just consider one another as the same. And that's why he says, I don't want you to be ignorant. I want you to know, as he talks about in verse 3 here, I want you to understand the head of every man is Christ, and the head of a woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. So in other words, there's this delineation of authority. In other words, it's God, Christ, the man, the woman. Now, I think that he's speaking generically. I don't think that he's saying, well, this just pertains to husbands and wives. He's going to talk about marriage because ultimately he's going back to Adam and Eve, and he wants to show from Adam and Eve, hey, what are the roles of men and women? What should women be shooting for? What should men be shooting for in terms of their roles? But I don't think he's saying, well, this is only dealing with married couples. I think he's saying men and women in general, this is your role, and this is therefore the way you should be going. And I want you to notice that he doesn't actually say, he says the head of every man is Christ. He doesn't say the head of every woman is the man, right? So it's not that. And if it meant wife, it would be the head of every wife is a husband or something, and ultimately, again, we're not talking about husbands and wives, otherwise that would make no sense. So I think he's talking about generic roles, even though he's going to go back to creation to talk about it. Now, some people will say, well, the word head here means source. So the source of every woman is the man, and it's just talking about how she's created, where she comes from, and all that sort of thing. Has anybody here watched my exegesis series where we talk about this passage?
That was a while ago, right?
Yeah, it was a long time ago. That definition of source comes from people doing what's really a bad word study, which is where they go to some other text that's talking about a river, and the word kephale, which means head, is the head of a river, and of course, what's the head of a river? The source. So they take that, and they're like, oh, look, a meaning of kephale can be source. And they go back to 1 Corinthians 11, and they're like, oh, well, that's a possible meaning here, source. The problem is that that's not a meaning of kephale. That's what it refers to when it's talking about the head of a river. Where's the river in 1 Corinthians 11? It's not here. So it doesn't mean source, and it's not referring to a source here. That's what I call an illegitimate referential transference. You're taking a reference from somewhere else, and you're plugging it into another text. And by doing that, you change what the text is talking about. So people are trying to argue, well, there's no authority that men have over women. They're equally the same. It's just talking about the fact that man's the source of the woman. That's not true. Head here clearly is referring to authority. Christ is the authority of every man. The man is the authority of the woman. God is the authority of Christ. It's talking about delineation of authority. That's very clear. That's the way that head is being used metaphorically. Any questions, comments on that? I think most people agree with that portion, right? That's not really that would be the controversial portion if we were in an evangelical church. I don't know if that's really a controversial portion here, or maybe some of you have questions about it. No? Good? All right. All right, so verse 4. Now, the reason why I have the Greek pulled up is because I want you to see that what you're reading in your English Bibles may not be what actually appears in the Greek. So I want you to, if you can follow on here. Every man who prophesies or prays or prophesies having down from the head, shames his head. That's all it says. Something that's down from the head. Having something that comes down from the head. That's what it says. It does not say the word covering. In fact, the word covering is never used in this passage anywhere, except when you get to the end of the passage where it's talking about the woman's long hair is used instead of, given to her instead of a covering.
The NASB says every man has something on his head.
Yeah, see, even that, does it say something on his head in the Greek? It's talking about something that comes down from the head. So what is it that comes down from the head? And that becomes the question. Is it a material cloth as a covering that comes down from the head? Or is it long hair that comes down from the head? The word, so this is the covering, quote unquote, that he's talking about. So to be covered or uncovered. Now, another misunderstanding is when you get further into the passage, it talks about being uncovered or covered. But then, well, what are we talking about by being uncovered? Covered or uncovered by what? Because it's the head that's to be covered or uncovered. And lower, when we get down to the end of the passage, it's clear that it's the hair that's a covering for what? Well, the head. So the head's not including the hair. The hair's a covering for the head, the long hair. So again, and if you look at this word to uncover or cover in the Septuagint and whatnot, it's used throughout. It just means to cover in general. It's not necessarily referring to a material cloth covering. Sometimes it talks about the covering of the ark, which is obviously made out of gold. Sometimes it's talking about how the people of God, they cover the land, or how men cover the earth, or whatever. So the reference of what is actually the covering is not specific. It just means something that covers something else. So the question, so it's what I'm trying to convey to you is that reading it in English is not solving the problem. Because you might say, well, it says covering, but you're misunderstanding what covering means. It's something that covers the head. The question still remains, what is it that's covering the head? What are we talking about? Is it long hair, short hair? Is it a cloth material covering? Now notice, whatever it is, it shames the head of the person if they've got the wrong thing. So if the woman isn't covered, it shames her head. If the man is covered, it shames his head. So it's a shame. Some people try to make the argument that the head that's being shamed is the authority, your authority. So he's shaming Christ by having a head that's covered, and then she's shaming her husband by not having a head that's covered. It's very clear that that's not the case throughout the passage. It's talking about what's a shame to her, and specifically, again, in the Greek, it will actually make that statement. It's to her or to him. He's shaming himself. She's shaming herself. So it's not talking about merely the authorities over them. And the shame is clearly of the self. As you get down, he'll use different terminology down here. I have it highlighted to try to show you what connects to what. That for a man to have long hair, it's a dishonor to him. But the woman to have long hair, it's a glory to her. So we're not talking about merely, well, it's to the man or to the woman above them or to Christ above him. We're talking about what's honorable to the actual person that's either wearing or not wearing the covering.
Ryan, do you think that included in that would be a dishonor to the head? For example, if a wife were uncovered, whatever that means, would not that be dishonor to her husband, particularly as she?
Yeah, no doubt. And it would be a dishonor to Christ if we're dishonoring Christ. That's all true. So it's true theology. It's just probably not what the text is saying. At the very best to get there, you could say that maybe Paul has it ambiguous so that you connect it to both. That's possible. But I wouldn't try to just exclude it to one versus the other or something. I'm going to do my best. I don't know if the sound's going to come through I don't think it's going to come through the... come through the TV or this computer, so hopefully this is not too bad, but this is someone who's actually arguing for a cloth covering. I want you to notice what he does, because I actually think the reason why people don't understand this passage is because a series of exegetical fallacies are being made when people approach it. He's talking about verse 4 where it says kata kephiles.
With me at Esther chapter 6 verse 12. Okay, so this is after Haman's plot has been exposed. We won't talk about the story. I think almost everybody here knows that story. In Esther chapter 6, verse 12, it says, "After Mordecai went back to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered." So in the Septuagint, that's kata kephales. Exactly the same expression is used in 1 Corinthians 11. Now, did Haman all of a sudden just grow his hair really long when his plan was uncovered and then he ran back with his hair suddenly grown long? Well, of course not. So he was ashamed. He knew he was caught, and so he got some kind of a fabric and he put it over his head, and he ran back in shame to run away from his fate, which I think he felt coming. Okay, so that's the one other place in the Bible where we see that exact same expression used, and it clearly is a reference to a fabric covering. I'll read to you another place where it is actually used in the secular literature as well. There's an author whose name is Plutarch, who actually lived at almost the same time. He lived between AD 40 and AD 120. And he writes about someone whose name is Scipio. And Scipio is some famous person. And just listen to this. So he says, "And as he came to Alexandria and landed, he went with his head covered," kata kephales, exact same expression. "And the Alexandrians running about him entreated," begged, "he would gratify them by uncovering and showing them his desirable face. When he uncovered his head, they clapped their hands with a loud acclamation." Okay, so it's kind of a random passage in secular literature, but clearly, again, this man Scipio he's trying to disguise himself. He's the equivalent of a movie star back there, and he covers his head, and everyone just begs him, and he lifts off his head, and everyone's clapping and is all excited. Okay, so just like Haman, we see that this is a cloth covering.
This is, I think, I don't know if these guys are some Hebrew roots movement or something. But if you look at their women, everywhere they go, their women have cloth coverings of the head, like you would see in, not really an Amish community. You'd see it more in just, yeah, there you go. Yeah, like a Russian community or something like that. Who, this guy? I think they belong to some Hebrew roots movement or something. I want you to notice the argument, though. This is really, really important. There's a couple things here. First of all, the chances, the phrase kata kephales in the Septuagint of Esther, I think it's 6:3 or whatever, or 6:12. One, there are multiple Greek versions, so actually that's just one reading of it. There are different readings. The chances that Paul is drawing from that passage are pretty much slim to none. There's nothing in Corinthians that says that Paul's reaching out for that passage at all. The fact that it's the same terminology doesn't mean anything. You can do that with lots of things and come up with really weird ideas. But beyond that, I want you to notice something, because he's focused on whether it's a material covering or not. He's not paying attention himself to what he's trying to do. If kata kephales refers to the same thing that it does in Esther and in Plutarch that he quoted, did you guys catch what he quoted? What kind of covering was it? What was Haman covering? His hair? He's ashamed and he's mourning. He's covering his face and running back to his house. And then if you just notice right there with the Plutarch quote, why did they want him to uncover himself? To see his face. This is talking about covering your face. So if the reference is the same, then you're arguing that, well, what Paul's actually saying is that women need to cover their faces, and that's the covering. That's the thing hanging down. Hanging down, covering their faces. I don't know anyone in church history. Maybe there are some people in some ethnic groups that have done that, but most people have not done that. Well, yeah, Muslims do, but they're not Christians, right? It's not. So in other words, if you go that route, you're going to have to say, well, if you carry the referent from those texts over, this is talking about a veil, and even more than a veil, it seems to be something where you can't even see the person's face. I don't think that's appropriate to do, obviously, and I don't think that's what Paul is getting at. I don't think he's saying, hey, women need to cover your face. There's a larger problem that I frankly never hear, and maybe it's because people are completely unaware of what the priests are wearing in the Old Testament. But I want you to notice if Paul is saying it's a shame to cover your head as a man, what do all the priests, the high priests, all the priests, and the Levites wear? Yep, coverings on the head. And you know what God says in Exodus, I think it's 28:40. God says, I want you to put a turban on, and why? For glory, for honor. That's why I want you to put the turban on, for honor. It will be honor to do that. It will be beautiful, and it will be honorable for the priest, the man, to wear it. So is Paul contradicting the Old Testament? Now we've got a real problem. We've got a covenant issue. And why did it suddenly change? It was honorable for the priest to wear it, but now it's dishonorable for a man to wear it? I would submit to you that this in no way can be talking about a cloth covering. Otherwise, you do have a big problem. Because Paul says that if a man covers his head, it's actually shameful. But the Old Testament says that the priests are actually wearing the covering because it's honor. Which is it? And it can't be like, it can't be just, they're not wearing it just day to day, out buying groceries. Like, it's specifically, they're in the ministry of God, prophesying and praying, doing this activity. So one of the big objections to, well, this couldn't be hair, is when we come down to these words right here. This is the word zeruo, and it comes from like a word that's zuo. Which means to scrape. It means to shave off the hair. So has anybody ever seen sheep sheared? It's like super short, super like almost to the skin. It's still there. It's still cut short, but it's... So when your translations translate it cut short, it makes it sound like, oh, she's just cutting her hair short. That's not what he's saying. He's saying the woman who actually has her hair short, what I would argue, has her hair short, is like the woman who shears or shaves the head. It's not saying, oh, because people try to think, oh, well, it's incoherent because you're saying that she has short hair, and then Paul's saying, well, she should just have short hair, and that's not what he's saying. He's saying it's similar to the argument he makes with the circumcised, saying, oh, to the Jews, hey, you need to be circumcised. You should go all the way and just castrate yourself if you're going to do that. That's his point. If you're going to cut your hair anyway, you might as well look like a prostitute, which is what prostitutes did. They cut their hair short. They shaved their heads in order to wear wigs, because especially in Rome. And I should mention, Corinth is a Roman colony. It's not necessarily a Greek city anymore. It was a Greek city. It was destroyed. It's basically like Rome 2, or Canada. Something that's basically like just like the culture of Rome. Prostitutes were taxed, and they were made to actually wear wigs that were blonde, or they had to dye their hair blonde. Most of them chose to shave their heads and wear wigs. So that's where the prostitution thing actually does come into play, in terms of saying, hey, she might as well just shave her head then, if she's going to dishonor it in that way. So going down then, I want you to notice the yellow of when we're talking about covering, the authority that is upon the head. And then we get down to verse 14, which I'll bring up on the English here too. Okay, does not nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, this is wears long hair, but has long hair, it is a disgrace to him, but if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for her hair is given to her. And unfortunately, again, this says for a covering. It makes it sound like it's just one of the coverings that she's given. In the Greek, this preposition anti, we use it to mean like against and whatnot. That's not what anti means in New Testament Greek. In New Testament Greek, it means in replace of. Christ is anti, a replacement for you. He died in place of you, instead of you. Christ died. Instead of a covering, she's given long hair. The long hair is the covering. The short hair is a shame to the man, as it says here. It's a dishonor the long hair on a man would be dishonor to the man. The short hair is for the man. That's what is honorable for him. Now, that's subjective. You can have, if you look at pictures of ancient Israelites, short hair can be down to your shoulders as a man. In fact, we have a picture of Jehu, the king, on the obelisk of Shalmaneser III. He's bowing down to Shalmaneser, and his hair goes down to the shoulder. That may be kings. They may look different, but you can see it's kind of relative to that. Long hair would be something past the shoulder of what Paul's talking about. Now, I'm not going to get out lengths and measurements or whatever, because, again, I think that the thrust here and what he's really concerned about is gender distinction. That women look like women and men look like men. Because they have, I think, mistakenly thought, well, we're all one in Christ. There's neither male nor female, and therefore there are no more roles, which is why he starts out not with the head covering conversation, but saying, I want you to understand the head of every man is Christ, but the head of a woman is the man. And hey, look, by the way, like the woman was created from the man. And, and there's no distinction between them. They need one another in order to distinguish one another and whatnot. So it's really about gender distinction. Your translations translate like, woman isn't independent from the man. That word independent is not there in the Greek. It says that the woman is from a man and the man from a woman and all from God. That's what it says in the Greek. So you're like, well, what from? What are we talking about? Are we talking about that they're made, created from there? Well, maybe. Or are we talking about that they're distinguished from one another by the other person? A man is a man because he's distinguished from a woman. A woman's a woman because she's distinguished from a man. That's a theory. It's not a definite, could be. But I think it actually is talking about gender distinction. And that's the thrust. That, hey, women, and therefore I think it's picking up from the law in terms of a man's not to wear the clothing of a woman. Woman's not to wear the clothing of a man. I think it's the same thing with hairstyle and what you look like and all that sort of thing. A woman is to look like a woman. A man is to look like a man. This is what I think is universal. Now, I realize some of you you believe you should wear coverings, your wives should wear coverings. That's fine. I do want to say what I've said before, if you've listened to the lesson from a couple weeks ago. If this is still not clear in your mind, and you think, well, I really think it is still something that I should do, then you should keep doing that. Don't stop doing it. If you think that your wife should wear a covering that's a cloth covering, then have your wife wear a cloth covering. If you're convinced that, it's not really a cloth covering, but your wife is convinced that it is a cloth covering, then don't make her not wear it. Like, she should wear it then. Because of the whole conversation we had a couple weeks ago about if someone thinks something is sin, unless they themselves are convinced that it's not, don't force them to do it, because you're destroying their conscience. You can teach all you want, but until the person is convinced that that's correct, they should remain doing what they're doing. I just want to make that really clear. So if you think it's still a cloth covering because that's what you're taught, you're just entrenched in it, and I, basically am spastic in the way I'm explaining this, and you don't get it, that's fine. Remain as you are. That's no problem. But I do want you to kind of look at this passage more closely and think about these things more closely than you may have in the past. Because there's a lot of really bad information out there. There's a lot of really bad exegesis. Like, in this other passage, this refers to this. That's not how you do word studies. In the background, it's this. And it's sort of like, well, what background? Is it universal? A universal background? Is it something we know that everybody's doing? Or is it just, a group here or there? You can't do that. You got to be really careful. The text has to reach out for that stuff. If it doesn't, don't bring it in. It's eisegesis. So if you were on a desert island and you just read Greek and you only had this passage and nothing else, where would you get the idea that this was a cloth covering from this text? When he's talking about, 1, gender distinction, and 2, the length of hair. And then he ends by saying that the woman's given her long hair instead of a covering. I don't think you could get it from there. I think that we have to put it into it. And I think the history of the church is a matter of putting it into it because, frankly, all culture did this. All the Romans covered. By the way, this makes no sense in the culture either because both Jews, Romans, everybody, both men and women all cover their head in religious services. And the head covering does not signify submission. That's another thing that's completely made up. One of the things I love to show people, in fact, I might have a picture of it. It's a picture of Augustus, and it says Pontificus Maximus. So he's the high priest, and he's wearing a head covering. Now, that guy is an emperor and the high priest of Rome, and he's wearing a head covering. In what way does that signify submission? It doesn't signify submission. As I just said, all the priests in the Old Testament are wearing head coverings. It has nothing to do with submission. It's never signified that, either in the Bible or outside of it. That is something we have tacked onto it. And because everyone wore a head covering, especially women, it just stayed throughout church history. And everybody saw this and like, oh yeah, women should wear head coverings. Well, that's what they were already doing anyway. So it was no big deal. It's not until today when women are not wearing head coverings that we have to then ask, okay, is this something that they should be doing? Is this text saying, hey, they have to wear it? And I'm well aware of the whole, whatever, I forget what it's called, the bonnet rebellion or whatever. Is that what it's called? The bonnet rebellion? It was like an Easter when all the women were like, we're not going to wear bonnets anymore because we're not in the submission to men. Again, that's a modern idea that it meant submission to men. Now, I still think that was wicked because they thought it meant submission and they threw it off. But that's not a biblical idea because obviously they have their heads covered throughout. He says in verse 16, finally, if anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. You couldn't possibly get a more ambiguous statement than that. It's like, what in the world does that mean? Does it mean that we have no such practice that women wear different lengths of hair? Or what does he mean? Or does it mean that we have no such practice and this is just something... People try to say, well, this is cultural, so he's saying we don't really have any practice like this. I don't think that's what he's actually trying to say. I think he's just saying that we don't have any other practice but this, that there is a distinction between male and female in every church. And so if you're going to be contentious, then you're basically arguing with the way God wants his church. The other ambiguous statement in the passage is that the reason why the woman is to do this is because of the angels, which, I mean, we all get that, right? Oh, because of the angels. It's like, yeah, I mean, I don't even need to explain. Right. Yeah, of course, because of the angels. There's a lot of different interpretations of that. There's two main ones. The first one is because angels are surrounding the service, and notice the activity is of prophesying and praying. They carry prayers to God and requests to God based on prayers, and they also carry revelation to people. And if the woman is actually in a place to where she's in rebellion, that's a garden situation where the devil actually can intercede and get hold of. The angels may actually refuse to carry those prayers or carry prophecy to them or whatever because of the disorder of the situation. Or some people will say, well, it just offends angels because they're looking for the order in the church and this is disordered. That's probably, something along those lines is probably the case. The other interpretation is talking about like a Genesis 6 type thing where angels who see women who are not actually connected to men, they're not under the headship of men, are for the taking. And so the sons of God come down and take the daughters of men and all that sort of thing. And so to save Christian women from the corruption, not that they would come down and have sex with women, but they would come down and corrupt them, then you need to make sure that it's conveyed that women are under the authority of headship. I don't think that's probably the case. I think largely in the New Testament, when you have fallen angels talking of, it'll use like words like demons. He even does this in the passage before, right? You're worshiping demons, not gods. And usually those demons that are worshiping are in the religion of Zeus are angels, fallen angels. They're not just like lower spirits or something. So I don't think angels here probably refers to fallen angels. It's possible, but I would say probably not. All right. Any questions, comments? Yeah, Tara.
I was just curious how, and maybe this is just totally unrelated. Then I think of the Nazarite, right? And he was supposed to have long hair.
Right.
So how do I make sense of all of that?
So I do think that long hair conveys submission. So I don't think a covering does not convey it, because everyone's wearing coverings. I mean, literally, you go out. It's how you protect your head from the sun. I mean, everyone's got a covering. So I don't think it conveys submission. I do think long hair conveys submission, because it conveys the female role. Even in Rome, a lot of men grew their hair out when they were the female role in the homosexual relationship. They grew it out, or they put it in a bun, but it grew long, basically. So I do think it conveys submission. And I think that the Nazarite he's to be basically the wife of God in that time, to where he has completely denied himself everything else and just devotion to God. So he's not able, to touch anything unclean at all. And he can't even, he can't touch even a grape because that's too close to wine. And he's to have his hair long. If you notice, Paul may have a Nazarite vow going on in Acts, and then what happens afterward? He cuts off his hair, and literally it's the same word. He actually shaves his head, because it's all the hair that then is dedicated to God.
Where is that?
Oh yikes! I'd have to look it up. Yeah, Samson's got a Nazarite vow.
Yeah.
Right.
So Bryan, some of us, like me, I have short hair, but I think I dress like a woman. Is that okay?
I would say it's not just dressing like a woman. I think your hair needs to look like a woman. And so this is why I would say I think it's gender distinction. I don't think that God intends this to be preached in Africa, where women can't grow their hair super, super long, like naturally, and somehow they can't obey this passage. I think what he's really trying to indicate is that it has to do with, you have to look feminine in your hair. And so that's what I would emphasize with people, is that just look feminine. You shouldn't look like a boy with your hair.
We talked about it before, and you said, no, my hair was fine. I curled it, it looks feminine.
Right.
But I just want to make sure that's...
Yeah, I think that's the issue. There are a lot of, I mean, is a woman with cancer not obeying? Well, no. The issue is like, yeah, I would just say it needs to be gender distinction, and in that case, with the woman with the cancer, you need to do everything you can to still look like a woman, in that regard.
There's usually a lot more going on other than the hair being cut short.
Right.
So focusing on the hair by itself, there's usually other rebellion happening with the short hair.
Well, there are women who dress like boys who have long hair too. I mean, And our culture has worked really hard to destroy gender distinctions, especially in our clothing, right? Jesse, I'm waiting.
Well, I got lots.
Let's hear it.
I have an hour or so. So I don't
Yeah, well, let's hear it.
All right.
We have to hear it in order to refute it. Come on.
All right. So I don't know. Let's see. We'll start with. I do think it's interesting how the Nazarite thing that Kara brought up in relation to the priest thing that you brought up. Actually, the priest being covered is something I haven't thought of before.
I've never heard anyone deal with it, because I think ultimately that's a massive problem, regardless of what you believe. That is a massive area of discontinuity, because you've literally got people who are the main people praying and prophesying in the Old Testament wearing the covering as men.
Yeah.
And this specifically says it's a shame to do that.
Right. And Tara asked me about the Nazarite thing the other day, and what I said was pretty much what you said about that. So the Nazarite obviously has a long hair, and the priest obviously has a cloth covering. Both of whom are in direct service to God, in a way that's different from the other population. I agreed. I said we wouldn't want to turn
Right.
in a peculiar sort of service,
Yeah.
like the priest cloth covering.
So can I know where you're going with that. So can I push back real quick? So everyone is wearing head coverings in the ancient Near East. All the Israelites are likely wearing. In fact, they are, or their scalps are getting burned to a crisp. They're all wearing head coverings. When you see pictures of them, they're wearing head coverings. That's not the same with the hair length. Not everybody has long hair. In fact, you look at pictures of people in the ancient Near East, they all have short hair as men. And so the difference in the cap or the turban of the priest is what it's made out of and what color it is. It's not that they're wearing a head covering, because everyone's doing that. All the men are doing that. So that's where I would push back and say that, again, that doesn't convey submission to God. It has nothing to do with it, because everyone's doing that. Israelite or not Israelite, everybody's wearing some sort of head covering. The long hair would, because I think long hair conveys submission, because it conveys the female role.
The concept of glory and covering, right? That the hair is both glorious for the woman, and also covers. Can you talk about a little bit about that, or how does that play into something that is both glorifying and covering at the same time?
I think there's a play on words there. So glory means what?
To draw attention to or highlight.
Well, yeah, draw attention to or highlight what? Yeah, beauty, right? Okay. Did you say that? Sorry, I might have missed it.
No.
Okay. So the woman's hair, the long hair, is her beauty. She is the beauty of the man. So I think it's talking about the fact that this has been what we talked about earlier with the CREC. That the woman participates in the man's role as the image and glory of God by being the man's glory, by being the helper. That's why she's made, right? To be the helper. So she participates in that. When she cuts her hair short, makes it look masculine or whatever, she conveys that she actually doesn't have to do with the man. As though she's the glory and image of God by herself. She doesn't need him. I think Paul's pushing back against that and saying that's not the case. And that's why he starts out with that statement. Christ is the head of every man. The man is the head of a woman. Because he wants to convey that, no, you're not participating in the image by yourself. You're doing it through the man. That's what Eve is doing. She's the helper, and she's made, therefore, to join him and now become the image with him.
Yeah.
I realize it's a larger discussion of image and all that.
So some of us women are single, we don't have husbands.
Right.
So I would think that then comes under the authority of the church, is that correct?
Right, and little daughters are not married, but then they through their fathers, right? But what I said earlier to the CRAC guys, is that even though you may not be a wife and mother, you're always working toward that. That's always your role. That's always the goal. Everything about you is motherhood. Everything about the man is fatherhood, even if he's not a father, even if he's 5 years old. I want to teach my sons to be a father one day, not a mother. Same thing with women. I want to teach my daughter to be a mother one day, not a father.
So it's still gender roles.
Yeah, it's still the same thing. And it's defined by that relationship, which is why I think he talks about that relationship here, not to limit it to that relationship, but to give us a focus of, regardless of whether you're married or not, why were you made the way you were made? What should you pursue? And if you're not married, you should still pursue those things that are motherhood within where you are, or work toward motherhood or whatever it may be. So like Paul himself is not married, right? And yet he constantly calls himself a father. He calls himself the father of the Corinthians even. Because he's a spiritual father, because fatherhood is the goal of who he is as a man. Is that helpful? And so women come alongside, even if they're not married, they come alongside as helpers to either the church, to the fathers, or to their husbands, and that's how they participate in the image in that way. Understanding the image is functional, not ontological. I don't know if we have to get into that conversation, but that's a huge conversation. But if that's misunderstood, we can talk about it. All right, continue.
So the man is the glory of God, and the woman is glory of
Glory and image of God, it says, and then he says the woman is the glory of man. And this is the reason he says why the woman is to have the covering, she's to be covered, and the man is not to be covered. So the man is not to be covered because he's the glory and image of God. The woman is to be covered because she's the glory of man.
Right. Yeah. And we're talking here in a liturgical context.
Correct. Well, a lot of people try to argue it's generic, but I think it's clear that it's the liturgical context, yeah.
Yeah, I think the broader.
Can I mention real quick? So let me mention the argument that they make and show you why that's bogus. So the argument they make is that he's about to talk about communion, and he says, when you gather together, when you come together, first of all, there's this communion thing. And so they'll say, oh, well, first of all, he's addressing this. So that's the first time he's talking about the assembly together. Problem is as you go back in Corinthians, it's very clear that he's talking about when they gather together. There's cliques, there's divisions. And then he even says in chapter 6, when you gather together, I'm going to be present with you, and I'm handing this man who's engaged in sexual immorality over to the devil. So he's talking about you can't do a chronological thing as though, now he's talking about the gathering. He's doing that sporadically throughout. And so I don't think it's a good argument to say, well, now he's talking about in the ecclesiastical context. That's all right. Just ask a question and run. I don't think it's the ecclesiastical context either, just because, again, everyone's wearing head coverings when you're out and about, and it doesn't make any sense then at that point. Either to rebuke women who are already wearing head coverings or to rebuke men who, which, again, he would then have to say that you're not allowed to wear head coverings when you're in the sun or something. I just don't think that's what he's arguing.
Why is it a tradition now for men not to wear head coverings? Like, when did that distinction start happening? Because, now if you go to church, if you pray, everyone takes off their hat.
Right.
It's like a symbol.
Yeah.
When did that become switching because everyone just did it and now not anymore?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think men, first of all, used to wear hats everywhere, even in the 20th century. So that happened somewhere in the 20th century. Obviously we wear hats, but I mean like everybody wore like a hat everywhere they went. You wore a suit, you wore a hat. But they did take them off in church, I think because of the understanding of this passage. So I think that throughout history, as soon as people were reading this passage, they were thinking, oh, well, I need to take my covering off because they read it as a covering. So it is read that way traditionally. I think it's a misreading, but it fits the culture because everybody did it. And therefore everybody, I think from that then did it whenever there was something respectful to take their hat off for, even if you weren't in church, right? Like if there was a lady, you'd take your hat off or whatever it would be as a sign of respect. I would say if you live in a culture like that, I don't think we live in a culture like that anymore, but if you do, maybe in the South or something, I would still do that because it's a show of respect for everyone. I wouldn't want to hit against that. But I don't know when it first came about to when men started taking off the hats, other than from, I think, their understanding of this passage.
But you think when the Greek was translated into the English is when it started being confused? Or do you think it started happening before that from the Greek passage?
I think the passage is so ambiguous that if you're not careful with it, you'll even misread the Greek. So I think that it's really early on. And again, because everyone's already doing it, it's just that's no big deal. It doesn't come up as like a red flashing light to anyone because everybody's already doing it. Women should wear head coverings in worship. That's already done by everybody. So of course, the issue would be more that men are wearing head coverings. So maybe you had men at that point say, oh, okay, well, we need to take it off. But the women were already doing it. So I think one of the things is, this is something you may not know. When you read church fathers, they're not great exegetes. They're largely on the run. They're being killed. They're and they're usually dealing with a lot of heresies, and they're pushback on that. So a lot of times you look at when they look at a text, it's devotional in nature, and they merely assume the meaning. They assume all sorts of. They're not doing exegesis like we are. They're not saying, "Oh, hey, did you are you actually reading this carefully?" Or they don't really do that, which is fine. I think that they come up with great theology. I think the Spirit of God leads them into the right theology a lot of times, but not always, because their exegesis isn't always there. However, let's say they, like I'm saying, that they were wrong about this. It's not a sin to wear a covering. So no one was ever in sin for it. Now, I may be in danger if I'm wrong, because if it's a sin not to wear a covering, I'm telling people not to wear it I'm not telling people not to wear it, but I'm telling people that you don't have to. So I have a greater risk. But the history of the church, no one's really in sin because you can wear a covering. And that's why I say to men, I'm like, if your wife wants to wear a covering, then let her wear a covering. If you want your wife to wear a covering as the wife, you should say, sure. Because it's not a sin to wear a covering. It's perfectly fine. Women look beautiful with coverings. It looks gorgeous on them, so great. Wear a covering. I'm really just trying to teach this and say, but I don't think this is saying you have to. I think it might be misunderstood by people. I have to say, whatever this is, again, it's not fulfilled by wearing that like Amish bra on your head or whatever. I don't even know what it's called, but you know what I mean? It kind of looks, I don't mean to be crude about it, but it kind of looks like, right? Or I think some Mennonites just have, it looks like a little yarmulke type thing or whatever. Again, literally it's hanging down from the head. So if you interpret this to be a cloth, we're talking about a cloth that comes down from the head, not a little beanie on the head or a couple little things on the head or something. We're talking about something that actually comes down from the head. I would argue, if you're talking about the cloth covering, if you're going to relate all the passages that talk about cloth coverings, those cloth coverings with these words have to do, again, with the veil, covering the face. And again, I've never seen people in church history or today practice that. So we're not even talking about the same cloth covering in that regard. And if you do think it's the cloth covering of the hair, now there's a contradiction between the priests that needs to be worked out. If you can work it out, I'd like to hear it. That'd be great. I don't know how that would be worked out so well, but Jesse, did you have another? Said you had like an hour long.
I don't want to hold it. What happened?
While you're thinking, if I could interject.
Yeah.
Just bring some church history into this as well. And to show that the church has dealt with rebellious churches that have thrown off role distinctions and say that marriage is evil and whatnot. And those have been, so a few studies of mine will know what I'm talking about. Kind of a broken record on this, but there's a synod in the 4th century called the Synod of Gangra. Gangra is a place in Armenia that was run by a bishop called Eustathius. Eustathius was pretty much teaching everything that Paul was arguing against to his churches. So this was a 4th century version of the church in Corinth, and a synod, a group of churches came together and basically excommunicate Eustathius and the churches that are with him, unless they turn and repent from what they're doing. And there's a portion from the synod, the letter, that I think it deals directly with 1 Corinthians 11, with the hair and some other things. But I just want to read a portion of it. This is just to show you what they're talking about. From their utter abhorrence of marriage, and from their adoption of the proposition that no one living in a state of marriage has any hope towards God, many misguided married women have forsaken their husbands, and husbands their wives. Then afterwards, not being able to contain that they have fallen into adultery. And so, those, such a principle as this, have come to shame. They were found, moreover, fomenting separations from the houses of God and of the church, treating the church and its members with disdain, and establishing separate meetings and assemblies, just like the church of Corinth were doing, and different doctrines and other things in opposition to the churches, and those things which are done in the church, wearing strange apparel, to the destruction of the common custom of dress, making distributions among themselves and their adherents as saints of the firstfruits of the church, which have from the first been given to the church. Slaves also, leaving their masters, and on account of their own strange apparel, acting insolently towards their masters. Women, too, disregarding decent custom, and instead of womanly apparel, wearing men's clothes, thinking to be justified because of these. While many of them, under a pretext of piety, cut off the growth of hair, which is natural to women. There's other things that don't pertain to what we're talking about. But they directly take the idea of the long hair being natural to women from 1 Corinthians 11.
Well, you could even cite the case of Joan of Arc or something, right? I mean, her chopping off her hair and dressing like a man and whatnot. So the reason why I did this, I realize this is probably harder to listen to than our normal studies because it's more technical. But I want you to notice that this is what the text is. This is an interpretation of the text. This is the Bible. This, insofar as it's correct, is the Word of God, but it often can be mistaken. So the reason why we did this is to show you that a lot of what's here isn't actually in here. It's an interpretation of it. It's not a heretical interpretation. You're not going to suddenly be, thrown into the gate of hell or something because you read this translation and misunderstood it. But I want you to be careful of getting practices and doctrines from this when it basically is putting in so much stuff that's not here. That was really the purpose of this. And so we were a little bit more slow moving than usual because of it, but I wanted you to see that. Anything else? Jesse?
I could keep going. My main concern, Bryan, is I'm not trying to challenge your position. I have my position and I'd like to talk about it, but I don't want to
Yeah, let me hear it. I don't want anybody to think, oh, well, you didn't really address this or that. It's like, I've studied this till the cows come home. Go ahead and just whatever, challenge me.
Okay. So, every man who has something on his head while praying or prophesying disgraces his head.
You just read English.
Yeah. No, that was me.
No, it wasn't. That's 4, right?
Yeah. Which I think it's a problem that is an equitable problem regardless of the position because of the parallel between the priest and the Nazarene. So if it's hair that's the covering, well then that's a problem on the Nazarite front. And if it's a cloth covering, then that's a problem that has to be worked out on the priest front. But it's a similar problem to be for both positions.
I don't think it is. The reason why I would say, again, that's why I pushed back and said because everyone's wearing a covering. It's a normative thing, whereas the Nazarite is not normative. It's actually meant to be shocking and outside of what's normal, so that the Nazarite is bringing a shame upon himself by having long hair, but he's doing it to show his submission to God. So I actually don't think that's a contradiction. I think it's a shame for the Nazarite. It's a state of humility. Which is why I think people do it when they're vowing something, like Paul, for instance, or whatever. I don't think you can't say the same thing for the head covering. The head covering is normative in the ancient Near Eastern world and in ancient Israel and for the priests. They have to wear it. It's not even that they do it as an exception. It's part of the robe. So I don't think it's the same thing if it's a shame, it's actually saying that all these people, everybody, is doing something shameful, and now I, Paul, am telling you that was always shameful and no one should have ever done it, both today in my culture and throughout time. And it's just I don't really think that's what Paul is saying, especially when it's not them saying, hey, this is a glory for us. It's God saying, hey, this turban's a glory for you. I want you to wear this because it's honor. It's the word kavod. So this is an honor to you, a glory to you, and then Paul says, oh, it's a dishonor, it's a shame. He can't be talking about the same thing.
But I thought it was bringing dishonor, if
Well, so I think the problem is I wouldn't necessarily say that he's bringing a shame. I think that's something we could say in general if he was dressing like a woman, like in general, because I think it's, again, a gender distinction thing. But the text is really clear that he brings shame or dishonor to himself. It literally says in the Greek, to himself. So I don't know if I would connect that to the Nazarite thing or the long hair and say, well, it's a dishonor to Christ in a Nazarite sense. I think in the normative sense, it would maybe bring dishonor. But I mean, I guess that's just the problem of the Nazarite thing of like, well, why? Because let's take it back for a minute. Everyone needs to agree, because that's the actual clear point of this passage, that a man having long hair is a shame to him. That's clear. There's what it says in the English, it says in the Greek. That's the clear part of the passage. So if there is a discontinuity there with a Nazarite, we all have to work that out. Because even if you believe in head coverings on top of that, you have to then believe about hair length as well, because that's very clear. So it's not a matter of either it's the length of hair or head coverings. It's either the length of hair and not head coverings, or the length of hair and head coverings. But it's both or one, but it's not just head coverings or whatever.
The head covering argument was made from the argument from natural law, which is short hair for a woman is shame.
Right.
And long hair for a man is dishonor.
Right. And I would say that's a normative argument that doesn't take into consideration the exception of the Nazarite vow. But you wouldn't be able to do that with the priest's turban, because everyone's wearing a covering, including the priest, and it's normative. Not just normative, but commanded.
But isn't there a difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament? Like only the priests were allowed to go into the Holy of Holies.
Right.
In the New Testament, the curtain is ripped, and now we are able to do that. So aren't there things that the priests weren't allowed to do that now we, as New Testament Christians, are allowed to do? Like, isn't there some difference in that?
I think there's a difference there. The only problem with this is the way that things are talked about. He goes back to creations as though it's always been a shame for men to have long hair. It's always been a shame, therefore, for men to have something hanging down from the head. And if it's always been a shame, that seems to actually have him critique what the priests are doing in the Old Testament, which God commanded them to do. So it almost seems like Paul is critiquing God for telling them to do it. It would be different if it was a matter of, hey, I just want you to do this for this thing. And if he had not said it's a glory, it's an honor, that maybe it would be less of a contradiction. But now we have a direct contradiction in God saying this turban on your head, this covering, is an honor. And if this is also a covering that Paul's talking about, now it's a dishonor. It's like, well, which is it?
So it would almost seem that everything you're saying, because there does seem to be contradictions, but there's not. So the only way it would seem to work is if it is gender identity.
Well, that's what I would argue. I think that's.
Otherwise, you're going to have all these other problems that are contradictory, and then you have to start doing this, and you can't do that.
Well, and let's remember the number one hermeneutical principle, and I think this is ignored by everyone who interprets this passage almost the other way. The hermeneutical principle is you interpret the ambiguous in light of the clear. What the covering is in the beginning of this chapter is very ambiguous. It's like, what are you talking about? Because he doesn't even use the terminology of like a head covering. It's not there in the Greek. The clear is that it's a shame, a dishonor for a man to have long hair. It's a shame, dishonor for a woman to have short hair. It's a glory for the woman to have long hair. That's the clear. So the clear then should then interpret all of the ambiguous statements, and then we should then say, oh, then the covering then is the hair. And we're talking about the distinctions in hair length because we're talking about gender distinctions. Those things that talk about gender distinction and the hair length are the clear part. Everything else is ambiguous. And yet I think so many people try to interpret the ambiguous and make that the standard, and then everything else gets put into the ambiguous. I think that's the wrong way. That's not good hermeneutics.
And you have to throw out the clear to do that.
Well, not that you have to throw out the clear necessarily, but the clear then gets second status, right? The long hair is a secondary thing. He really just wants you to wear a head covering that's cloth covering.
What you do is you give up, you almost make that more important than the gender distinction.
Right. No, I think that often. Look, I mean, when you watch a lot of these guys, that's what they do. Now, to be fair, there are guys who don't do that as well. That they can balance it out. But I'm just saying, hermeneutically speaking, that's not how you come to truth of a passage. You never take what's ambiguous and then everything gets shoved into that. You interpret what's ambiguous by the clear statements.
I don't think this has anything to do with it, but I'm not quite sure. It just occurred to me. Is it a cultural, traditional sort of thing for a woman to walk down the aisle with a veil over her head and over her face, and the father to put it behind her at a wedding? Is it anything to do with
As actually from a superstition that the spirits are going to come get you, and therefore that's the whole thing with the bridesmaids as well. You veil. It's to hide her, and so it used to be that the bridesmaids also wore veils, so that the evil spirits that would get them would be confused.
Wow.
Yeah.
I always heard it was because Rebecca put her veil on when she went to meet Isaac.
Well, they wear veils in the ancient Near East. Women do, and that's how Jacob is deceived, right? With Leah. But that's just a common cultural issue. It's not necessarily. I don't know if our wedding thing comes from that, or because I think it's probably more directly linked to the superstition. But again, there's nothing wrong with wearing the veil. I mean, if that's what you're linking it to, and not the other,
I think the principle of the veil is again a covering of glory. Like Moses is wearing.
Moses wears a veil, covers his face. Yeah. Notice that the covering's always covering the face. When you're talking about women, or you're talking about, it's the covering of the face. So look, you can actually, I'll tell you right now, you can solve the problem between the priests and this text if you conclude this is a veil that covers the face. That would be different. Now you don't have a contradiction. But I don't know anyone who has ever done that. So has the church been in disobedience for 2,000 years on this issue? I mean, maybe, but I don't think so.
Just the Muslims.
Yeah, just the ones who convert.
I think
Time's up. No more questions.
I think part of the so it's obvious by the passage that we're talking about covering the hair, not covering the face.
Well, just to be, I want us to be really precise.
Yeah.
We're talking about covering the head, not the hair. It never mentions the hair, and even as you get down later, it says the hair is the covering. Covering of what? The head. So the hair is not being included with the head. It's really important to understand that. Otherwise, yeah, obviously if the hair is included, then it's got to be some extra covering on it. So it's the covering of the head that we're talking about, not including the hair.
Yes, I agree. I think part of the exercise of going through the Kata Kluma and is to see, and it's not just the Esther passage. And you're right. There's certainly a lot of passages that it talks about where we're dealing with the tabernacle or the Ark of the Covenant. But every time
Actually, can I just, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but because I did do the word study on all of these, it's only used a couple times to refer to a cloth covering. And the most prominent time I can remember is when Tamar wears the covering.
yeah,
And what kind of covering is that?
it's a veil.
Yeah, so he can't see her face. Every other time, and the majority of times, it's not talking about any sort of cloth covering at all. It's talking about just anything covering anything.
Yes. Well, sort of. There are cloth coverings included in the as it comes to talk about the tabernacle.
Right.
But of course, it's cloth.
Well, I mean, cloth covering of a
Sure.
person. Yeah.
So whenever it's talking about a person, it's talking about a cloth covering, and it is. You're right. It's always about the veil. It's always about the face, right? So
I don't know if it's always. I'd have to. It's been a while since I've done it, but I almost think you could cover a person with something else, like water. I think covers people. It literally can be. This is why you don't carry the referent, right? Otherwise, you end up with, oh yeah, it's water. I mean,
Right, and I think the point is not to carry the referent, but to define the semantic range, that at least it's possible that we're talking about a cloth cover. So
Yeah, because anything that covers something else can actually, the word can describe that, right?
sure. And obviously they would point out that nowhere else is it talking about hair, unless you include like the skins of goats in the tabernacle, and that's hair or whatever.
Right.
But nowhere else is talking about hair, but there's certainly plenty where it's talking about the cloth covering. Particularly probably closest to the context is where Paul in Corinthians talks about Moses being veiled
Right.
before the presence of God.
So we would say when we're talking about a cloth covering that covers a human, it's almost always a veil.
In other words, it's always describing the face being covered
Right.
with cloth.
Right.
So precisely correctly, we're talking about the covering of the head, right? Whether that's hair or cloth. I wouldn't want to say that the word study seals the point that it's certainly cloth, but I'd say it makes the semantic range wide enough that it could be cloth.
Yeah, so let me say two things. One, that's true, because again, it can refer to anything that covers anything.
Right.
Two, I think you're making the mistake that these guys make because they want to prove that it's cloth, but then they don't want to prove that it's a veil. So it's like it's almost generically talking about it when if you're going to do that, then it's specifically talking about a veil. So it's not just cloth. It's not talking about like a washcloth. Like it's not talking about like a three-piece suit. It's talking specifically about a veil cloth. So if you're going to make that argument, then this would be, you would have to then say, well, this at least could be talking about a veil that covers your face. And I would say, well, sure, I agree. I don't think it is, but it could.
Right, and so I think the difference could be between a veil that covers the face versus a veil that covers the head or the hair, depending on which way.
Well, where do you see that it's a veil that doesn't cover the face used?
Well, we're talking about a blank that covers the blank, right? So there's
Right.
two pieces of it, right?
Yeah.
The second blank in all the other contexts is the face, but here it's the head. And now we're talking, and then the first blank is.
So it would be different than all other contexts in what you're saying.
Well, yeah, but it would be a veil, right? But it would be covering something different.
Well, I guess by veil I mean a veil is a covering that covers, like on a human, covers the face. I guess that's the way I'm using veil. Well, that's the way our veils are. But the veils in the Old Testament seem to be that you actually can't see the face of the person. Otherwise, Jacob would just look through the veil and be like, wait a minute, you're not Rachel. So, in other words, the veil is a complete covering, which I think, don't they do this in Jewish context sometimes still? With it, it's actually covering the face of the woman. It's like complete covering, right?
I was just going to say, in the, I'm trying to remember, Epaphroditus, or, it's one of the, I can't remember, I gotta look it up, but it's one of the church fathers that's listing what churches should be doing.
Yeah.
And when he talks about the head coverings, these are massive. Like, there's no hair showing. And there's probably not maybe covering the face, but it's probably covering like side profiles. So like the little bonnets that like churches wear today, back then they would say we're in disobedience to the command.
Oh, like the nuns that have like this whole thing going on?
It would be no hair showing, and at least the side profile of the woman hidden. Maybe not a veil, but they were massive.
See, I would still say, though, that doesn't describe the Old Testament. But I get what you're saying. I absolutely agree, because A can cover B. And you can use that word cover for anything. I mean, literally, we can cover you with sharks. I mean, it could be anything. Yeah, Sharknado. It could literally be anything that covers something else. So the question is what's covering what in this text? Because we have to get the specific referent from this text. And where does it mention what kind of covering it is in this text? The only mention of what the covering is, or a covering, is the long hair. There's no other mention of any other covering in the text. We have to put that into the text, and now we're eisegeting, not exegeting.
Right. Okay. I think we agreed enough on that first point.
Yeah.
Again, I know the kids are getting restless, so I could come down here and talk to you if you want to start playing. But I'll keep you on until you come down. I'm not quite sure the word in which to build this, so I'm just gonna.
Okay.
As I think it might be built.
Sure.
The word. When I had to go as a kid, we all agreed that this is a liturgical context, right? In context with the previous chapters.
Not just liturgical context, it's specifically saying when she prays and prophesies. So it's not even necessarily talking about when she's in the assembly, unless you include, and you have to remember, people aren't doing silent prayers. You pray out loud. You prophesy out loud. This is out loud. And Paul later on is going to say, I don't want you all doing it at the same time. So this is a woman who is the focal point of the assembly at that point, praying and prophesying. It's not just someone in her seat praying and prophesying.
There's a different word that's used for covering at the end.
Yeah.
In verse 16.
Yeah, the parabolon.
How does that factor into your? Does that factor in all the arguments, or why would Paul use that different word?
Because now he's actually saying that instead of an actual covering, she's given her long hair. So that actually is her covering.
Yeah, okay. If it's the long hair that's the cover, this is not a nail in the coffin. But I would say if it's the long hair that's the covering throughout, then the word would have been consistent throughout. I agree that the hair is a covering, that it's given to her for a glory and a covering, but that particularly in the liturgical context is a different type of covering. Hence the cataclase in the first 15 verses, and
That
my phone's over there with you. The different Greek word in verse 16.
okay. The katakalupto is what you're talking about, right? And then katakalupto
Yeah, the same.
is an adjective.
Right. So those words are used for covering all the way down.
No. They're used. There's an adjective for someone who is covered by something. The word used down below when it says the long hair is a covering is actually the noun covering, talking about a covering. These words are not talking about a covering. They're talking about someone who is covered by something. So either someone who is uncovered or someone who is covered. But it's not talking about the covering. I think that's a mistake that you might be making from the English. So these aren't different words for covering in the sense of the noun. They're different words because they're adjective, something that is covered. Now, the thing that covers them is the long hair that's given as a covering. That's the noun. That's the only time you have a noun that's the covering in the passage. That's what I mean. There is no covering mentioned in this passage except the last one that says the long hair is the covering. Do you understand? Is that too lofty of a grammatical argument or something? Or in other words, I cover someone with the covering.
Right.
What I covered them with is what these other words are talking about. The actual covering is the other words, but what I covered them with is just that word at the end.
It's a different root, though. It's not.
Yeah, they're different words.
Right.
But one is talking about. Do you understand that? So, in other words, if I cover the floor, you don't know what yet I cover the floor with.
Sure.
The floor is just being covered.
Right.
That's what these adjectives are talking about. I've covered this person with something. The noun at the end that tells you the covering is the long hair. That's the only time you have that. What is the covering? That's the only time that question is answered. So now you know, well, what am I covering the floor with? Well, I'm covering with long hair. In this case, it's the head of the woman I'm covering with.
So you're saying Paul defines what the covering is in the last statement.
Right. That's the only statement made of what the covering actually is. Instead of a covering or for in place of a covering, it's long hair. Does the English, I think, make that unclear?
No, I don't. Can I grab my phone? So
Yeah, where are you looking? See, this is the look. We can just go through all of them if you want. I mean,
are they? I don't think they're all. I think there's some nouns in there based on the Catholic root.
well, this is all. The very first statement is just this:
Right. So that.
having down from the head. There's no word here for covering. Then you have uncovered. So she's uncovered, but by what? Uncovered by what? You don't know. Then you get down here to the woman is covered, but covered by what? Then let her be covered. Again, covered by what? And then you go down here. Let's see. The head is. He ought to have his head covered. Covered by what? Or not have his head covered. Sorry, he ought not to have his head covered. And then it says authority upon her head or the head. What is that? The woman is not to be uncovered. Uncovered by what? And then finally you have the word actually that the long hair is given to her, if you believe the variant there, instead of a covering. That's where you... So this is actually talking about a covering. And what is it? It's the kame, long hair.
Let me get back to you on that after I get.
Okay. I do think maybe the English is messing you up there, thinking that it was talking about coverings when it's not actually.
You're saying there's not a noun in verse 4?
No, verse 4 is just... Verse 4 doesn't even have an adjective. Verse 4 is just... having down from the head. That's it. That's all it says.
Right, but that's the noun form of that kata, right?
Well, yeah, kafale is head. That's a noun. Kata is a preposition, meaning down from. So the idea is something is hanging down from the head. What is hanging down from the head? It doesn't tell you. So the problem is when you have an English translation come along and be like, oh yeah, she ought to have a covering, on her head. It's like, that's not what it says.
What part of speech is that next?
Ekon is the verb. It's a participle. Right here? This is the word to shame. Kaidaskuo, it means to be ashamed or have shame or something. So she shames her kafalain, her head. Yeah, I mean, he does a lot. It's a pretty cool little thing where he does with Kephale. So that's why I brought up the Greek, because it's like you don't realize how much is actually not there, because there's so much interpretation that has gone on with translators of this passage. If I were to read the passage, if I didn't know Greek and I just read it in English, I would 100% think women are to be, and I did. I used to defend it constantly. You guys are saying it's cultural. It's not cultural. Women should be wearing head coverings. I just say it all the time because I read it from the English. When I learned Greek, I realized, yikes, like half of that's in the English is not even there. That's a total interpretation that's being read into the text.
One of the things I'd want to look at is why in verse 16 the noun form of kataluma is not used instead of the peribola. I'm mispronouncing it. It's used like as a different root, but that's something I can look at later.
There's a noun form of it? I don't even know if there's a noun form, is there? Again, I think, are you getting that from the...
I don't know. I'd have to do that work. I'm assuming that there is. Just because the root is totally different.
There's not always noun forms.
There is a noun form. It's katakalupsis. It's barely used. So you can see how... Usually when you have a word that's used a lot, this entry is going to be huge. Instead, you have this like little sentence here. And it's secular Greek. I don't see it anywhere in like koine, or ever used in the New Testament or even the Septuagint. So, I mean, that's one of the reasons why you may not use it or something.
That for me would be like a side point, anyways.
Yeah.
As to why he changes the root in verse 16.
The verb is used a lot, though, covering something.
Right. So one of the classic arguments that I've heard you deal with before is, the classic argument would be out of verse 6, right? That says, well, in the English, I would say, for if a woman does not cover her head, let her also have her hair cut off. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or shaved, let her cover her head.
Right.
The classic argument for cloth covering would be that does not make sense if it is if the covering is the hair, right? Because the equivalent would be if it's disgraceful for a woman to have short hair, then let her have short hair, right?
Right.
Syllogism would work. You dealt with that in the past, right? By saying that there's a difference between those two words in Greek. The again, those two right there, yeah, right there.
Yeah, Cairo, and then the other one is Zerao.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. So one is talking about shaving. Literally, this word, well, you can see right here, it comes from zuo, which means scrape. So it's talking about that close shave. The other one is actually talking about cutting the hair to the point of you're shearing, like shearing a sheep, which is the most common word for shearing a sheep, actually, which is you're cutting it almost like it to where there's still hair there, but you're cutting it like almost like a buzz type cut or whatever, which again was often done because people wore wigs for that reason, and specifically a lot of prostitutes did that.
Right. Yeah. Now, I guess there's 2 points that I don't know enough Greek to know if this is true, but the because of how it's phrased in Greek, that Paul's using them as synonyms because of how the sentence is written.
That's possible.
And then to that point, just looking at the usage of the words in Acts, both of the words are used in the same context as Paul or the people he's paying for take the Nazarite vow and remove the hair from their head. The 2 words
Right.
are used side by side. They're each in different contexts for the same thing.
Yeah.
So it seems like at least I can't speak to the Greek, but it seems like on word usage that there's synonyms.
Yeah, they can be. So in that regard, this is just like kind of like a type of not alliteration, but a type of literary to where you say like you say synonyms together where they're different words, but you're really just talking about the same thing. Yeah, I forget what the literary thing is, but
If that's true, then the traditional argument holds, right? If the words are synonyms,
no.
then the traditional argument, which would be
No, that would mean that they're both talking about actually shaving the head.
so we would read it. How would you read it? So
To shear or shave your head. Let her be sheared or shaven.
woman does not cover. Let's read it like the way that you would interpret it, right? So, or if a woman does not have long hair, let her also have.
Let her be.
Okay, let her be. Which one is that?
Let her be shaven.
Which one exactly?
That's the first one. That's the Zurao.
Zerao. Yeah. Okay. Let her be Zerao. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to two things that are the same thing, which equals shaven, then let her have long hair.
No, then let her be covered.
Right.
Which must have Then let her have long hair. Yeah. Right. Let her actually have long hair. Then be covered by her long hair.
Okay.
Which I would say I think that's his argument that Paul uses in a similar fashion with the Judaizers and the circumcision. So if you're going to be circumcised, then go all the way and castrate yourself. And you might say, oh, well, I mean, it's one is cutting the genitals, so this has to mean something else. And it's like, no, both are cutting the genitals. One's just talking about cutting the genitals all the way. And that's all I think he's saying here. Should I end the Bible just so those who want to stay can stay?
Sure. Yeah.
because we've gone way longer than we usually go. Which I kind of warned you guys we would on this one, but so let's end in a word of prayer. And anybody wants to stay for further discussion, you can. Actually, Nick, you want to pray? Pray us out.
Father, we come before you this evening. I'm grateful, Lord, that we're able to do a deep dive in your word. It's a lot of interesting things to think about, think through, Lord. And far be it from us, Lord, to not get exactly what you want us to get from your text. May the Spirit guide us and lead us as we read through things like this, difficult things, hard things to understand, that you would illuminate the truth of those things to us, Lord, and let us grow in holiness and maturity in our walk as we read even things like this, Lord. Grateful to be able to hear what I did today. Grateful for Bryan and his work that he has done in this, Lord. And I pray that you would help us to all take this and to think through it and convict us one way or the other, Lord, or be careful as we read through it. At least that's one major thing I've gotten out of this, Lord, tonight, is to be able to be very, very careful not to be interpreting it in a way, Lord, that's, Lord, not even necessarily from the original languages. It's very helpful to be able to see what it says there in that context. And so that was helpful, and I'm grateful for that. Help us, Lord, as we navigate through these difficult texts, and Lord, let it produce some kind of a practical change in our lives. For your glory, we ask in Jesus' name.
Amen. Thanks, guys.